Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 18 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. This week's topic is The Great Producers Part 5, the 90s. And I'll explain that title a little bit later. As always, I've got a new mid-roll, so I don't need to do all of my promotion as usual, but please take a moment and pay attention to that mid-roll. I know that other ads run throughout this, and I'm grateful for them because they do bring in some revenue, but that mid-roll is really where the support happens. I mean, you're listening and you're watching is where it happens too, but that it really is very important. And if I can add one thing to it is tell somebody about this podcast. Tell somebody who you know loves music of all kinds, or even this specific episode about the 90s, and let them know that Music is Not a Genre is the kind of podcast that covers everything. And if you're on patreon.com/music is not a genre, you can even suggest what I cover. That has happened before. But we're going to get right into this topic. I've got a busy production day, so I want to just kind of get into it and get you into it too. And that is, again, The Great Producers Part 5, the 90s. And why is the title the 90s? Well, I look at my list here, and I have maybe 10 titles. The Sound of the Shift, the In-Between 90s, The Hidden Shift, The Digilogue, The 90s Time Glitch, the High Art of Lo-Fi, The Grid Ate the Groove, The File Buried the Fader Met the Mouse, blah, blah, blah. It's none of them worked for me. And frankly, the 90s kind of captures the 90s more than any of those do. But some of them do make the point that the 90s were very much a hinge decade in the sense that they were equal parts the old school analog world and the new upcoming digital world. It was a time when if you existed at a certain age, you were experiencing both. And that's a real privilege because anyone younger than a millennial probably doesn't remember what the analog world was like. And anybody older than, let's say, Gen X has some, boomers have experience of the digital world, but in a way that is quite, I think, less central than people of Gen X, millennials, such and such. And I think that I was going to call it the thick hinge, but it just sounded so awkward that I couldn't freaking use that. Why? Because the 90s were a time when the music got thicker than ever. Sound-wise, the bottom and middle frequencies were fully fleshed out, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And, of course, the hinge was what I just talked about, right? So, again, the show format, tech and music changes, and then I'm going to go through all of the good producers and conclusions and et cetera, and the, featured song and questions and all of that stuff. And, of course, my bonus M extra at patreon.com/music is not a genre is the history of the loudness wars. I got softer when I said that. Let me back up from the mic. The loudness wars! So that's what the bonus M extra is at patreon.com/music is not a genre. Please go check that out, support the podcast, and you get a great bonus. I'm really excited to talk about the loudness wars. Sources are Wikipedia, Google, musicradar.com. Disclaimers, I will go into the tech to illustrate how it affected music, but not such a detailed as to make this a tech episode. I say that for every one of these in this series, producer series. My producer choices are not arbitrary, but they are incomplete. I couldn't talk about every great producer of the 90s, and they're probably biased to a degree, although not that much, to be honest. Again, most great producers worked in more than one decade, but I try to include them in the decade in which they made the most impact. So sometimes I'll mention a producer twice. Let's get into the first section here. Tech and music changes. Though decade shifts are never as hardline as we remember them to be, and there's always some holdover before the new decade truly takes shape, I would argue, and I've said this before, that no decade shift was as abrupt as the 80s becoming the 90s. By no later than 1991, several factors hit that almost immediately made every facet of 80s music sound passé, obsolete, if not outright offensive to many people. And as usual, these changes in the aesthetics of music, its overall recording sound, production shifts, introduction of new genres, subgenres, were driven by the technology. I say tech and music changes together because they are so intertwined always. And of course, I have to address the big echoing elephant in the room first, which is reverb. right? I discussed in the last episode of this series how the two halves of the 80s were quite different and how the qualities we associate with the 80s end up usually being from the second half, which includes the big reverb, those big hitting snares, the entire drum kit awash in reverb, vocals in reverb, guitars in reverb, keys having reverb. The 80s had a very trebly sound, and that permeated every single genre to one degree or another. Really, except for some underground, which were kind of prefacing the 90s, but that's not really 80s, you know, it's like pre-90s. Without fail, every single one of these genres did a hard shift. Starting in 1991, and by 1993, we have completely shifted over, eliminating the reverb on all fronts, pretty much, almost, and prizing deeper, warmer shades. Some examples. So hip-hop's boom bap you can hear in your head with reverb when you think, boom, 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 boom. A lot of reverb on those 80s ones in many ways. Any Run DMC song, you know, some of the early Beastie Boys as well, as opposed to something like the song Pete Rock and CL Smooth's 1992 song They Reminisce Over You, which is a lot drier. R&B, any of Bobby Brown's 80s songs, and they weren't even the most reverb heavy, but as opposed to the song Poison, Belle Biv DeVoe, which where's that reverb, right? It's just a couple years later. Pop dance, milieu. Milli Vanilli's Echo was everywhere, as opposed to Groove is in the Heart, which was bone dry. Oh, and felt like a revelation when you heard it. You know, going through that period, a lot of this shift from washy reverb, everything needed to sound like it was being played in an arena, whatever, to this more kind of in-your-face, intimate, dry sound, hit you hard. Alt rock, Just Like Heaven, was quite reverby, as it was a lot of Cure in that era, as opposed to, you know, REM's early 90s albums, which hardly had any reverb. Or something closer to my wheelhouse, and a great example of how the artists themselves made this shift, is how the 80s production on Matthew Sweet's album, 1989 album Earth, has that, you know, reverby sound, and not the worst ever, but still very 80s, compared to his breakout album 1991's Girlfriend, which again, that song Girlfriend, I remember thinking, can a song be that dry? You know, and it freaking killed. Hard rock, any glam metal band, as opposed to any grunge band, you can see the difference. Or earlier Metallica with Metallica's Black Album, you know, which was Metallica. This was partly because tastes change, but also very much because recording technology, both on the back end in the studio and the front end, the consumer, the formats and stuff, allowed for far more bottom range. Digital recording allowed for far more space in general, not just meaning you can fit more songs, more music, you know, longer songs, etc., in the same or smaller storage space. You know, think how the difference between vinyl and cassettes, you know, an average cassette, not a long playing, you know, cassette, and vinyl, you're talking about 45 minutes of music, whatever. And ADATs and CDs, 75 minutes, something like that. But you could also fit more information within each song. And I talked about that in a previous bonus episode, which you can look up. Since the 80s was all about layering and density, but the technology hadn't quite caught up with the desire for things to be layered and dense, that meant that the overall sound was thin. There wasn't enough room for all that information. You had to compromise. You either fit the full spectrum of sound, low bass, booming bass to high treble, and have simpler arrangements, which hip-hop did a lot, or go complex, and also EDM and such, or go complex and dense and layered and end up losing a lot of the warmth and bottom because all those layers take up more space. By the 90s, with studios shifting to DAWs, digital audio workstations, ADATs, digital audio tape, CDs, in other words, from analog to digital, across the board, slowly but surely, not only did the typical analog hiss disappear, space increased so much that it caught up with the desire to use the full spectrum as much as you want. Music had already been trending in the very late 80s to want to have more thump and impact. So by the time the 90s hit and the tech was ready for it, all those aforementioned genre shifts were primed. That said, the 90s were still very much, as I mentioned, a hinge decade. So while by the end of the decade everything was in place to make those recordings seem as modern as anything after, there were still some changes that make the recording quality of some of the music sound dated. So, that was just how it was then. With the issue of thinness or tinniness solved, in terms of having a good bottom, a good mid, that 90s music, rock music, especially, but all across the board, even R&B, was much warmer, thicker than 80s music. Then came the problem of loudness, which again, bonus some extra at patreon.com/music is not a genre. I'm going to talk about the loudness wars, the entire history, and it's a longer history than you think. I have mentioned this before in previous episodes, but it bears repeating. The big 3 factors that make recordings sound quote-unquote old are 1, clarity. How well were the sounds captured, mixed, and mastered? Did the technology, was it used well enough, and was it good enough to capture it pristinely? Number 2, depth. How full and thick is the sound, especially on the low end? And you're missing a lot of things that have been unmastered. You don't hear that bottom as much. Old dance songs, disco, whatever, that haven't been remastered. And number 3, loudness. You can argue that the first 2 are qualitative, meaning like with any medium, it takes time to work out the kinks and achieve certain ideals and optimizations. It took a while for the world in general to understand how to gain more clarity in recording, how to find more depth, and have the technology catch up to be able to capture and retain that depth of thickness, let's just say. And I would say the third one, loudness, is 100% a question of setting an arbitrary standard, because loudness is something that a user can change. I'd venture to say that if someone prior to the mid-late 1990s felt like music wasn't loud enough, they just turned it up. Once the loudness wars took effect, and you didn't think about it that way. You were like, song's a little lower, you freaking turned the radio up, or whatever it was. Most albums were mixed and mastered in a way that each song was kind of, consistent. But if you put 2 different albums on, you're going to have variation. You just turned it up or down. But once the loudness wars took effect, it was the industry itself that decided music wasn't loud enough. Not the first time, but again, technology caught up to what they were hoping for, and they kept compressing and turning everything up until it reached the absolute maximum. That means that almost all music recorded after this point has all 3 of those factors above: clarity, depth, and loudness, and will sound as modern as anything in this decade. Yes. One more time, in the bonus MXtra at patreon.com/music is not a genre, I go into huge detail about the loudness wars, including its history. The exception to all of this is something else that changed in the 90s, which is making the choice to go lo-fi. So now that it was becoming increasingly possible for anyone at any level to achieve optimal sound based on those 3 factors, some producers and musicians, especially towards the middle and end of the decade, were choosing to go against that by deliberately adding in or creating issues, glitches, limitations, lo-fi things. Think of musicians like the Elephant Six Collective, Olivia Tremor, Control, Apples and Stereo, etc., who were very deliberately lo-fi, most of whom recorded either on analog systems like 4 and 8 track cassettes recorders, or sometimes straight to cassette, and did it on purpose. Part of it might have been, financially speaking, but then it became an aesthetic. Glitchy elements were added on purpose. Think of Beck's O-Delay. Where it's at, he deliberately distorted his voice, or how his samples were very lo-fi and they had that scratchy vinyl sound, or think of the stutters and weird breaks and offbeat stuff in electronic music from that decade and beyond. Even auto-tune's first use was meant to be a glitch, and Missy Elliott's work is full of these on-purpose glitches, stemming from the introduction of pitch correction in 1997, which some might argue eventually made quote-unquote perfection the norm, took some of the natural blue note humanity out of singing, but we'll get into that maybe. Along the lines of that kind of digital manipulation, we take for granted now that we can take a pre-recorded sound or clip that's in one tempo and speed it up or slow it down without affecting its pitch or integrity. That was impossible before the mid to late 90s. If you wanted, that's why if someone was using a sample in the 80s or early mid 90s and that original song was in one key, but it was too fast, if they slowed the sample down, the new song had to be in that different key. And then when pitch correction and all the, the certain aspects of technology changed now, and I do this all the time, I don't use samples as well. I do use some samples, but kind of public domain and cleared samples, whatever. That stuff is so easy to change. You can't go too far. It starts to sound a little warbly, at least with my technology. I'm sure with more expensive technology you can. But the point being, I can even make my voice sound normal, changing its pitch. Instead of taking it down and I'll sing like this, or taking it up and I sing like, nope. It just sounds like a normal voice. And that was impossible before this period. We also take for granted that we can take, say, a chorus or a drum loop and copy and paste as much as we want. Oh, I like how I did that chorus. I'm just going to use it again. That kind of thing. No tape splicing, or no need to re-record even, which allowed for more complex loops that could, if desired, be changed subtly for each iteration. So you copy and paste, but you take the guitar out, something like that, or the bass. I've done that before, thus bringing about massive amounts of loop-based songwriting that would affect all of the music since then. And these kinds of tools were available to anyone with a moderate amount of money because DAWs were now more or less affordable, widely available, and packed with features like this, which meant that relatively inexpensive home studios that could actually compete with the big time were popping up everywhere, just as PCs made that kind of home affordable transition 10 or so years before. Eventually, the music recording caught up. This feeds into an argument I've been making for at least 15 years, which is, don't listen to people that claim that you need to spend a lot of money and buy only the best equipment to make good recordings. Yes, you need baseline, working, functional, adequate equipment that captures your sound, that processes your sound. But beyond that, the quality boost is negligible until you get into the millions, and then who has that kind of money? But anything below that, not much of a difference at all. Stop sweating the money. Get the stuff you can afford and get to recording now. I'm telling you, I know a friend who wants to get into voiceovers and has been listening to too many people who tell her you need to get such and such microphone and such interface and whatever and spend this much money. And I'm like, no, you don't. I have done national commercials from home with the very cheap equipment that I have because I understand how to use it and I understand how to manipulate my environment. PSA over. A few other changes through the second half of the decade. Things that were initially rejected from the 1980s, and I'd say rightly so because of market saturation, and sonic saturation, and, artists were relying too much on the same thing as were producers and industry execs. That stuff was creeping back in the second half of the 90s and being used more judiciously. This is partly because now the bottom end of a recording could more effectively support and enfold the top end, so it didn't sound as tinny and as washy, and partly because producers were getting savvy about how to use these sweeteners, flourishes, tools to better effect and not overwhelming. Think of the Spice Girls. Those songs could have easily been written and recorded in the 1980s. They wouldn't have sounded as thumping and tight, but in either case, you get stabs and other high-end elements and synths that were shied away from in the early 90s, now they're coming back in the late 90s. And of course, to me, the hugest shift heading toward the 2000s is that grunge and grunge-adjacent alt-type music rejected almost all keyboards and electronics of any kind in the first half of the 90s, while by the late 90s and certainly into the 2000s, which is next in this series, synths and other electronic elements were back in rock. Drier and more integrated than in the 80s, but certainly no longer avoided. Think of the early Smashing Pumpkins, which I don't think they had any keyboards, except for, Tonight, although I think those were those actual strings. And then the late 90s Pumpkins, which started using a lot of keyboards and electronic elements. The sum of these changes is that digital recording made it so easy to choose what quote-unquote rules to follow or not, and on the fly in the studio, in fact, you didn't have to make decisions in advance, that sounds and even the songs themselves were being crafted on the spot. And that went for producers and music creators with tons of money and with no money. The possibilities went from what outboard instruments and effects modules you could afford and fit in your space to how many plugins you can buy and save and honestly share and get for free from friends and colleagues on your system. or on an external hard drive. And of course, the latter group was exponentially larger than the former, which meant that anyone could make anything sound like anything, which has been fun for me. And while they generally didn't, because genre still ruled the day back then, that sense of freedom would grow over the next 15 years and would effectively blur genre lines to the point of factionalism among both musicians and fans being all but wiped out. Do whatever you want. Don't worry about where it fits. We'll talk about the pros and cons of this in the conclusions. And a final word about these tech changes. Like the decade itself being a straddle or hinge, most studios were not only digital or only analog. They were hybrids of both, and not by choice, as it would happen in later decades. I mean, if they chose to get digital, but they were keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, with the rest of the industry. But the point being, there wasn't somebody saying, I'm going to go, old school analog. Things were still shifting. So this was a mix, and some of the past setups were hanging on and still very viable and necessary, and then people didn't want to waste money getting rid of them, and then they added in electronic elements. Again, we'll flesh this out in the conclusions, but first let's get to some great producers of the 1990s. I may not get through all of these before the break, but that's okay. Great producers of the 1990s. Two separate forces were at play that helped to make the 90s such a hinge decade. First, the coming of age of auteur producers. I've talked about this since, I think, the first episode of this series. And despite one person, arranged shows and productions being around for decades and having peaks like Brian Wilson and Sly and Prince, among many others, it wasn't until the dominant takeover of digital audio workstations, DAWs, that the auteur mentality spread everywhere. And while subsequent decades would see these numbers rise exponentially, it was the 90s when it was first possible for the average person to have everything they needed at their fingertips. Second factor, despite the huge continued growth of the music industry, growth that would see both the number of official releases and overall sales numbers rise and rise, heading to a peak in the 2000s, which I talked about in my album series, the business was actually further splitting the way it had started to in the 1980s. It would get even worse in the 2000s and beyond, and 1,000% parallel the same split in the greater corporate and financial worlds, which is what? That the bigger artists got more of the work and more of the money, and the smaller artists had to divide smaller and smaller scraps amongst themselves. I have a vague memory of things being relatively more equal in the late 80s and early 90s, and by the late 90s, we were all struggling to make a buck. And that was glory days compared to now. What this means for this episode's list is that unlike with other decade reviews I've done, the producer list for the 90s was probably smaller than those, because major works were being consolidated behind fewer and fewer power players, and everyone wanted a piece of the success that everyone else was having, so they would use the same producers. One reason just about every genre by mid-decade got exhausted, basically, and homogenized. And we'll discuss that more in the conclusions. So, first, sort of by genre, more or less, as best as possible, great producers of the 1990s, hip-hop, Dr. Dre. If the 1980s established hip-hop as a cultural force, the 90s professionalized and expanded its ambitions and its reach. And Dre was central to that transformation. With the Chronic, he distilled West Coast G-Funk into a cinematic experience. Wu-Tang even talked about how they like to make their album cinematic. And Dre was no exception to that. I know there are different people. I'm just saying that was kind of a trend then. Parliament-inspired synth leads, elastic bass lines, pristine drum programming, mixes that felt impossibly wide and expensive, even though they were pretty minimalist. Dre's genius was less about density, right, than precision. Everything felt deliberately placed. He was an architect. He was also an architect of careers through Death Row and Aftermath, Snoop Dogg, Eminem, superstars working with him. I mean, Dre, you can't mention producers in history without mentioning Dr. Dre. He raised the bar for, pristine fidelity and mix and clarity in hip hop. By mid-decade, you couldn't just put out any old thing. You had to emulate what Dre was doing in terms of the quality of the mix and the mastering, polish, And then you have Q-Tip. As the primary sonic architect behind A Tribe Called Quest, Q-Tip advanced a radically different hip-hop aesthetic. On the album The Low End Theory, he centered organic instruments, upright bass, jazz samples, spacious drum programming. Where others were going for more layers and maximalism, Q-Tip prized feel and giving space to the production. His production invited introspection. It normalized subtlety in rap, conversational flow, philosophical theme, warm textures, alt hip-hop to a T. And any alt hip-hop that came after owes a debt to Q-Tip. DJ Premier. DJ Premier chopped up jazz samples. He had a crisp boom bap, aesthetic for the drums, defined some part of the East Coast sound of that decade. Working with Gang Starr and numerous collaborators, he perfected the art of the scratched vocal hook and hard, head-nodding minimalism. One of my favorite eras of hip-hop. He became a benchmark for lyrical hip-hop credibility because that type of production allows for the lyrics to be denser, etc., and influenced underground rap and on some overground rap for decades. Then a couple more here in this, and then I think it's going to be time for a break. Timbaland reimagined rhythm itself. His beats for Missy Elliott on Supa Dupa Fly and collaborations with Aaliyah used negative space as a weapon, kind of like Thelonious Monk did. Strange, percussive sounds, syncopated kicks, unconventional vocal phrasing made R&B, it was very futuristic. His production was futuristic and minimalist, and it had tension, but release as well. His influence is so audible in things that came in the 2000s that were even out of hip-hop. Including things like trap and stuff like that. RZA, again, mentioned production for Wu-Tang Clan, especially Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. It was grimy, off-kilter, soul loops, dusty drums, cinematic, as I mentioned, kung fu samples, whatever. They created a mythology through their sound and through their visuals too. But, he embraced imperfection. This is, again, part of what happened in the 90s where you could choose to be dusty and imperfect. Distortion, uneven levels, raw tape hiss. Authenticity could outweigh polish. It made the illusion that it was more authentic than something else because it's gritty, The East Coast Renaissance of the mid-90s followed that. I will go on, actually. Let's do some of the pop producers. You got to go with Babyface. Defined mainstream R&B balladry in the 90s. His productions for Boyz II Men and Toni Braxton, lush harmonies, elegant chord changes, emotionally direct lyrics, almost orchestral arrangements. He streamlined soul into crossover form without diluting its soul, its heart. The adult contemporary dominance of 90s R&B owes a lot to Babyface, as do a lot of artists. Teddy Riley became synonymous with the rise of New Jack Swing. Of course, he started in the 80s, but man, albums like Michael Jackson's Dangerous, he fused hip-hop drum programming with sleek R&B arrangements, helping define the rhythmic language of early 90s pop and urban radio. His productions emphasized hard, syncopated beats, punchy digital keyboards, layered vocal hooks, creating a sound that bridged street credibility and mainstream pop appeal, something he built on from his late 80s work. Butch Vig, different side of pop, stands at the crossroads of underground grit and pop architecture, producing, of course, Nirvana's Nevermind, which was not pop, but it had a pop aesthetic in many ways. It wasn't just about capturing distortion, but about making it hooky. He layered guitars meticulously. It wasn't just slapdash. Doubled vocals strategically, gave drums force without losing their clarity. And he embraced the studio as an instrument, which is something that had been cropping up for a couple of decades. And that carried into his band, Garbage, whose sleek, electronically inflected textures really led into the late 90s and 2000s. And, when you think of like Britney Spears and Avril Lavigne and stuff like that, Garbage is kind of where, and Gwen, alternative and meticulous could coexist. And you know what? Let's keep going. I'm thinking actually that this is a time to take a break. Sorry to keep you in suspense there. I'm going to get into the rock section of great producers of the 1990s right after this mid-roll. Please take a listen to it or watch it and patronize whatever it is I'm talking about. And, I'll see you in a minute. Hey, MxG fans, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, please take some time out to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of everything I do, nickdimatteo.com really does have it all. If you're interested in unique and quirky t-shirts that I've all personally hand designed, go to nickdimatteo.com/shop and you can find it all there, including discounts if you sign up for my newsletter or Patreon. If you're someone who's always wanted to write a song, has just never figured out how to get there, let me work with you. I am the Song Coach. Go to nickdimatteo.com/the Song Coach, and whether you're a complete beginner or completely advanced, I can get you there. You can book a free 30-minute call right there on the site. And of course, I am always releasing new music. Go to nickdimatteo.com/music to find it all. My complete discography is there. All of the social links are there. And of course, please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Do it for the podcast. Do it for the music. Sharing is especially valuable to all of us indie creators. I really appreciate your support, your eyes and ears. Thank you for hanging with me for this mid-roll, and let's get back to the show. All right, we are back. Those of you watching, how do you like my shirt? I designed it. It says whatever with some little teeny middle fingers. It's very 90s in its own way, right? And I'm a big line art fan. Please go to nickdimatteo.com/shop and buy one. Back to producers of the 90s, rock. Rick Rubin. I'm mentioning him again because he transitioned from the Def Jam into kind of his guru persona and did far more well-known and successful work from the 90s on out. Rubin's 90s work was about what? Reduction. Oh, and Blood, Sugar, Sex, Magic, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He captured their live chemistry and still gave it space to let it breathe. He removed elements more than adding them, guiding artists toward their kind of essence state, kind of the diamond state. What's left when you strip everything else away? That's you. He was very psychological in the way he is, in the way he produces. He creates environments where artists confront their core identity across rock, hip hop, metal. He prioritized feel over ornamentation. Kind of an anti-producer, kind of a non-producer. The pro of letting artists follow their muse is that you get perhaps the truest representation of that artist. The con is that it's quite possible that either the artists themselves don't know what they want from their sound, or they default to bare minimums, which they think is more authentic, which often results in really freaking boring productions. He has taken over some artists. The Chili Peppers are never boring. That's why it works with them. Johnny Cash, you can't deny the soulfulness and everything he does is compelling, why it worked. Other artists he's worked with, man, that's fallen flat and it's disappointed me. And that's because maybe the artist didn't bring enough interest to the table. I don't know. I tend to only like the stuff he does with the artists I prefer, although he also, I think, didn't he produce Biaba Doobie? Am I wrong about that? I believe he did, and I liked that album, but I didn't love it. I don't think it was my favorite from her. Other producers, though, have compelled me to like an artist more because of the work they've done. That's not going to happen with Rick Rubin or Jack Antonoff. Steve Albini. Albini resisted the title producer, preferring to just be recording engineer. He was the knob tweaker, and he let the artists do what they wanted, but also it was more of a philosophical distinction because he did have a certain approach to things, and he believed that records should document the band's performance and not change it into something else. Minimal overdubs, natural room ambience, aggressive mic placement which really defined his sound, captured bands in their rawest, most confrontational form. His work with Nirvana on In Utero was a statement against the high gloss alt rock sound that followed in other artists from after Nevermind. People got a little more polished, I guess. Not In Utero. Albini's mixes were abrasive, roomy, and unflattering in the best way. No artifice. Throughout the 90s and post-hardcore scene, 90s indie and post-hardcore scenes, his ethos became a moral counterweight to major label sheen. Even though he worked for major labels, he never sounded major label. Transparent in every sense of what he did, and a deep skepticism toward corporate music culture. Bob Rock, what a great name for being a rock producer, became synonymous with the oversized sound of early 90s rock. A Metallica fused heavy metal aggression with pristine studio polish, kind of what we were talking about, what Albini didn't do, turning the band's complex thrash into arena-scale rock. A lot of early Metallica fans didn't like their Black Album because of that. I did, but whatever. Rock's approach emphasized massive drums, dense guitar layering, and meticulous vocal production, transforming raw metal bands into radio acts without sacrificing their power. But now we get to one of my favorites, Brendan O'Brien. Brendan O'Brien was the great translator between the underground and arena. He was like between Albini and Bob Rock. He produced Pearl Jam verses. He delivered punchy, radio-ready mixes without sanding down the band's intensity or quirkiness. His drums were tight and physical. Guitars were thick and had punch and grit and rawness, but they were controlled. O'Brien's strength lay in structure and dynamics. He was a master at dynamics. Really, anytime I listen to something he did, it's why I know his name. Because I would listen and be like, who the hell produced this? He could make loud bands sound disciplined, and vice versa. With artists like Stone Temple Pilots, he helped codify post-grunge's muscular clarity, a sound that would dominate rock radio for years and years. O'Brien refined the chaos into something stadium. So he allowed chaos to exist with arena. And Bob Rock was all arena and slick, and Albini was like all chaos. Yeah, it's simplistic, but you get what I'm saying. And then a whole different bag, Nigel Godrich. Nigel Godrich became synonymous with Radiohead's evolution. On OK Computer, he fused analog warmth with digital alienation. And that is not easy to do, to be both digitally cold and analog warm. His meticulous layering and atmospheric instincts help articulate late 90s technological anxiety. Y2K! Godrich's approach blurred producer and band member, shaping arrangements as deeply as the performances did. Some electronic producers, the Dust Brothers, they embodied sample era excess. They started with Paul's Boutique in the 80s, but then their 90s influence flourished and bloomed with Odelay, Beck. They stacked samples into surreal, hyper-detailed collages that felt both chaotic and danceable, tight. In an era before aggressive sample clearance enforcement fully tightened, they demonstrated how studio layering could become psychedelic storytelling. I like their use of samples because it's psychedelic. Their work bridged hip-hop and alt-rock. William Orbit became synonymous with the atmospheric turn of late 90s pop. So Madonna's Ray of Light. Atmospheric, not quite Balearic, but kind of like, if you think of techno as kind of on the floor, gritty, it makes you want to do this with your teeth. And house as kind of like maybe in the middle of your chest. This kind of like rave culture. William Orbit was a real architect of that kind of sound, of kind of ambient electronics with dance, and he brought that underground textures into mainstream pop as well. He favored shimmering synth layers, intricate programming, a sense of spiritual spaciousness, helping redefine pop's relationship with electronic music. And my God, would that have an influence on like every single decade since then. And what unites all these producers from the various different disciplines here is not a single sound, but a shift in power. In the 1990s, producers were auteurs in many ways, brand names whose sonic signatures carried commercial. Think of Timbaland. That's a brand name. I mean, got his name from a brand, but even he became a brand name even beyond that. A lot of people, when they hear that name, think more of him than the Boots. Whether through Dr. Dre's polish, Albini's austerity, or again, Timbaland's futurism, they reshaped not just songs, but the expectations of what recorded music could be and how producers shaped the identity of an artist. And again, here we are, 8 minutes or so into the second half of this episode, and I'm done mentioning 90s producers. Again, I guarantee you there are 3 or 4 producers, you all out there who know 90s music will say, why didn't you mention them? And to that I say, yeah, absolutely, tell me. But those notwithstanding, you can even add them to this list. There's still very few producers that rose to the level of being mentioned here. And again, it's because of the factors I mentioned in the introduction. Speaking of, things that frame the meat, conclusions. Some podcasters, musicians, and fans claim that the 1990s was the last era of good rock music, or some will say the 2000s. It's bullshit, of course, because that's never true. But let's flesh out why people might think that. Setting aside generational bias, because there's no accounting for that. It galls me how you can hear a quote from the 1950s, let's say, as somebody saying music's not as good as it was in the 1930s or 40s, and people saying the same damn thing 20, 40, 60 years later. And it's just a lack of awareness, I mean, for the longest time, and still in some circles, there are people who believe the 70s was the pinnacle of recording. And I talked about that 2 episodes ago in this series. And again, I don't think anything was the pinnacle of anything. Certain things did rise in those decades, but then they were subsumed. They were integrated and changed and morphed, and new things were added that were equally good in their own ways. The aesthetic of very even mixing of analog and digital that defined the 90s and early 2000s is another big reason this was such a hinge decade, right? That I think is one of the reasons. Did I flesh out? I'm looking at my notes here. Why do people might think this? Yes. So I do think that was one of the reasons. When you think about there was a choice made in the 2000s by many artists, when you say the White Stripes, whatever, to reject the digital part of things and go analog, or people who reject analog altogether, the people who can't afford it, like homegrown artists, Little Nas X and people like that, who eventually went all digital. This was a time when it was a pretty even mix, which you can see why that would be so appealing. The taking over of the auteur to the point of artists' identities being driven, shaped, and even dictated by producers to an unforeseen degree would mean that the power of the music was so consolidated into one specific sound. It's partly why those sounds got so damn overplayed by the mid-90s and things had to shift, and I won't say this, lots of post-grunge music was freaking great, or at least above average. I was always a Third Eye Blind fan. That's post-grunge, Third Eye Blind, whatever. Now, some people are Creed fans, Nickelback, post-grunge. I'm not, but I'm saying that there was quite a lot of quality music that stemmed from grunge after grunge. That said, a lot of it was just retread of the same sound from before, And so people will say, well, once that ended, rock went downhill. That's a matter of opinion. MP3s prior to large-scale file sharing. Interesting point here. We'll get to large-scale file sharing in the 2000s, the next episode of this series. But MP3s allowed people in the music industry to discover and share and sample more things more quickly, creating the beginning of massive genre blurring and new subgenres popping up everywhere. It's why you had somebody like a Timbaland or Dust Brothers, and the stuff that Beck did and all of that, where people, and a lot of the other hip-hop people, where people were mixing in things that they couldn't have gotten their hands on. And I mean both from the actual sample itself. So in other words, using that actual recorded sample or recreating it, or just the vibe of something. Oh, I heard such and such and I need to capture that vibe. We forget that our music listening was severely limited back then. Limited by how much time you had to spend flipping the dials on the radio to hit every station that every kind of music and hear every song. And B, how much money you had to buy the things that you wanted to hear that you read about. And if you read about them, it's because you had to buy a magazine to write about it. So a lot of this all cost money, which is better for the artists, but worse for the fans. And so I think back now to why some of those things were more memorable to me and are still my favorites. It's not just because of age. It's because we were so limited that we had a lot less to listen to. And so those things stood out more. Now we have literally almost everything to listen to. And so it's harder for things to stand out. And it's harder for things to make this as strong of an impact. That era started to trickle in the 90s when people could start to gather that much music. And this is bringing us to a major point we need to dive into. We've talked often about how success compels the industry to do it again, to do the same thing over again. So a good single, repeat that single, to switch it up a little bit, but do the same thing, or even in a whole album. And how eventually that ends up watering down the product. Think of how people got tired of disco. Why? Because, they kept repeating it to the point where it lost its soul, really. Now, it morphed. Again, I talked about that in an episode years ago about how disco morphed into something that really was still disco, but people didn't call it that because the name itself was more anathema than the music. People still loved the music. Or again, I'll mention how grunge got watered down. What started to happen in the 90s was something similar, but it was far bigger. As technology became easier to use and cheaper to acquire, everyone started working with the same mix of tools. As sound capture and mixing reached optimal levels, as discussed earlier, everyone strove to achieve the same basic mix. While this is a positive in terms of base level average quality, and how there eventually came to be far less variability from low to high budget productions, which indie artists appreciate, or even in between genres, which ears appreciate, it made the listening experience smoother. The negative is that all producers, engineers, and even some artists strove to do what the most successful of those were doing, and anything that didn't fit that mold was being ironed out. So you could say that this happened countless times before. So somebody like the Beatles or Prince comes along and everybody tries to copy them. But the shift by the late 90s was that it became so mechanized, so accessible, so easy to do that it spread more rapidly. It's another reason why this was such a hinge decade, in that the industry players were just learning all this. Rapid in the 90s was turtle compared to today, but it was still super fast compared to the 80s. There was still a lot of holdover of the old ways, and by the time the 2000s and 2010s hit, everything we're talking about here was so baked in that homogenization of genres has created, to me, far blander trends in the pop world through today than even the proto-homogenized music of the 1990s. 90s was like a template for what was coming. So the pros and cons of the blurring of genres. The pros, cross-pollination creates new sounds and subgenres. Wreck. People are less likely to stay in one camp, more likely to cross genre boundaries and discover new things, which gives more acceptance to a fan liking different kinds of music as well. And you don't have to be in a certain camp. The cons, the more the blurring happens, the less innovation occurs within or between genres because it's all melding together. The producers and artists feel the need to pull in the same mix of stuff regardless of their genre, further blanding and homogenizing music and leaving less room for surprise. So we have at our fingertips everything. And this idea of needing to replicate success means that most producers and artists only, stick to the same 10 things. Each decade of music has given us both benefits and deficits. Same holds true for the 1990s. I'd say the biggest benefit from this decade is achieving a level of recording quality that is still the standard, and the base standard at least, and which more often than not includes that aforementioned mix of analog and digital. Though from the 2000s on, the weight has shifted heavily to the digital side, and now it's shifting back to analog in many ways. The biggest deficit of the 90s was, again, that technology became so easy to employ. In itself, not a deficit. Let me just state that. Easily accessible technology has given us many benefits, has made things easier for so many people, especially people without a lot of money, and music creators, which are usually the same thing. But that ease of use also made it far too easy to achieve a sameness in recording and producing aesthetics that has shaped music far too much since then. Of course, one of the results of this was the loudness wars, using technology to maximize everything all the time. And I'll be talking about that in the bonus MXtra, patreon.com/music is not a genre, the whole history of the loudness wars and a lot of detail of the technology. Though every decade, and yes, you rockists, even the last 2.5 decades, has its weird and unexpected stuff, the 90s was, so far, the last time a huge chunk of weird was not just an underground sensation, but part of the fabric of the mainstream for almost the entire decade. That, in fact, it was almost a prerequisite for success that you had to have some weirdness or at least a standout idiosyncrasies, which in recent years has come back. Ironic, since this was occurring just as the homogenization movement was gelling as well. You divided for, opposing forces. Okay, now the fun begins. Favorite 90s producers. Q-Tip. His mix of samples and a live feel, structure and freedom, hookiness and introspection, dry sparseness and intricate layering, and above all, the coolest laid-back funkiness maybe ever. He set the standard for an era as sort of the flip side of what Dre set forth and became a template for so much of what I both love and do myself. Look up Rek's song, The Power of Repetition Everlasting. Is that Q-Tip influence? Yes. And that's because to me, it's still the pinnacle of hip-hop production in so many ways. Not to mention the work he did with the Beastie Boys on Get It Together just slays. Brendan O'Brien is another favorite. I can't tell you how many times I've referred to this dude. Anytime I produce forceful rock, I'm going for his aesthetic. Driving, intense, full and loud, yet so clear and controlled. While there are so many other kinds of rock and rock production I enjoy, I firmly believe that Brendan set a standard for impact with clarity that every similar rock band has worked to achieve since then and kind of has to just to keep up. Rek's song Porch Step is a good example of how I've tried to emulate this. And again, final mention of the Loudness Wars, bonus MXtra, patreon.com/music is not a genre. He was a big part of that, Brendan. Nigel Godrich, artists and producers had been successfully working to make the robotic more human and personal since at least the 1970s. Nigel brought it home, realized it to its fullest, and managed to do it over and over in ways that didn't feel repetitive, even when loops were used and or an aesthetic was maintained for an entire album. He and Radiohead created songs that were both clean and vulnerable, grounded and anxious, and encompassing some parts of the full spectrum of emotions. Songs of mine, like Rek's Final Call, Nick's Come a Little Closer, Rek's Where You Go, all owe a lot to Nigel. I did a recent recording of something that is the featured song of this. And in fact, let's get to that featured song. It's sort of from the 90s. It's a 90s episode, so this is a song that I wrote in the late 90s. So it 1,000% has that 90s vibe all over it. I never recorded it. It's called Fool for You. But I just did record it few weeks ago, and it's part of my massive upcoming album under my previous artist name, Nick, because it's all previous music, called Valley of the Unreleased. I initially wrote this as an alt country song, like kind of Wicked Game, what's his name, Chris Isaac. But since as far back as that era, I was already hearing the massive crossovers of country and R&B long before this current era. I decided to produce Fool for You more on the R&B side because it's more my vibe anyway. You can tell right away the Radiohead had influence because the keyboard, the synth sound I chose, and the riff I wrote are reminiscent of Everything in Its Right Place. Not a ripoff, reminiscent. Interpolation in a way. And the production is, or side, what do they call it? Side recording? I forget. I don't know. Parallel. Production is sparse, just enough to get the song across, set the mood, support the vocal. Story of the song is a guy mourning a breakup because no matter who else he's with, he can't get that person out of his mind. He's obsessed in a way that's holding him back and with someone he can never have again. Thus that darker, keening quality to the music. I've seen so many lovers come and go. Who was meant for me, I'll never know, because I can't get you out of my mind. I know you're the one, but the damage has been done. Whatever. You listen to it. It'll be coming soon. The story was 100% made up. A lot of what I write is inspired by something from my life. This wasn't. I'd never had that experience at that point, though 20 years later I would. The song so far has been released only on Patreon and will not be streamable for at least a couple of months. So you're getting somewhat of an exclusive here. Stick around for a minute to hear it, or support the show, patreon.com/music is not a genre. And you can hear not only Full For You, but all of the other songs I've completed so far and any other upcoming songs I don't plan to release until later. You can hear them now on patreon.com/music is not a genre. Questions? Are you a fan of 90s production? Could you hear the huge shift in sound quality from the 80s until then? Qualities. I don't mean better to worse, worse to better. I mean the quality of how things were recorded and mastered, etc. What are some of your favorite 90s albums? Who are some of your favorite 90s producers? Were you aware of how much a pivot the 90s was from the old ways to what we consider the norm today? And were you aware that that pivot was a pretty even mix of the old world and the new world, that anyone who grew up and lived in the 90s was very prepared for what was coming in the 2000s, but was also very comfortable with what came before? And you can say that a little bit about people in the 2000s, sort of, but not really. The 90s were really the pinnacle of that. So I'd like to know the answers, your answers to all of these questions and more, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Stick around for that featured song, and I will talk to you next week.
It's that time again. Wanna make you mine again. And I know what a fool can do, 'cause I'm a fool for you. Seen so many lovers come and go. Who was meant for me, I'll never know, 'cause I can't get you out of my mind. And what a fool can do, 'cause I'm a fool for you. Yeah, it's that time again. Wanna make you mine again. And I know what a fool can do, 'cause I'm a fool for you. Yeah, I'm a fool for you. I'm a fool for you.